Welcome to the Global Peace Film Festival Lives Online Conversation 2023 Festival Edition. Please join me, Kelly Devine, the Artistic Director, and Nina Strike, the Founder and Festival Director, in conversation with Aleem Karmali, the Director of Thrown into Canada, the Settlement of Asian Refugees from Uganda, a film that you can see at the upcoming Global Peace Film Festival in September. Please go to peacefilmfest.org for all information about the film. But now let's join Aleem in conversation. Welcome, Aleem.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, Aleem. It's wonderful to have you here with us. So let's start out. Tell us a little bit about the film.
So Thrown into Canada is a feature-length documentary. It's my first feature-length documentary. And it's about the settlement of about 8,000 South Asian refugees who arrived in Canada in 1972 after Idi Amin, the president of Uganda at the time, he expelled all the South Asians from Uganda. And so Canada took, there's probably about between 50 to 80,000 people who were expelled, and Canada took about 8,000 of them. And the story is told from a Canadian sort of perspective, and one of the things that I wanted to look at is that this is actually a pretty significant event in Canadian history, in terms of refugee and immigration history, because it's the first major movement in Canadian history of non-European, non-white refugees that Canada accepted. And so the film sort of looks at what are some of the forces that shaped Idi Amin's decision to expel the Asians from Uganda, especially looking at the history of colonialism, and how that also shaped Canadian policies, and then going forward, how Canada was actually shaped by this refugee movement and its refugee policies. And even just more broadly, maybe the changing diversity of Canadian society. And so, the other thing about this is it's long been regarded as a very successful refugee movement in Canadian history. People uphold the Ugandan Asians as, this is the model of refugee resettlement kind of thing. And so I wanted to look into what were some of the factors that maybe created that situation as well. Because of a shared British colonial history, these people were highly educated, they were fluent in English, they had a lot of advantages in a sense, and that made them in a way kind of ideal refugees. If you're thinking about bringing in a movement of people that, this really showed people that in Canada that, it's not a bad thing to bring non-European refugees, that they can integrate. And so in a sense, it was considered very successful. I probe actually a little bit into what does that mean? Is it really as successful? Was it really as successful of a movement as people say it was? But it kind of in a way opened the door for other non-European refugee movements. So, Vietnamese, people from Vietnam, people from Afghanistan, Syria, and even looking at how it impacted Canadian officials. Canadian refugee policy was shaped by this movement. They made decisions going forward based on this that allowed the evolution of Canadian refugee policies. A notable thing of that would be the sponsorship program. Canada was the first country in the world to create a program where private citizens could sponsor refugees to come to the country. And that was something that came out of the learnings of the Uganda movement. So that's a bit about the film.
Well, and one of the things we love to ask filmmakers is how they came to the topic. And certainly you have a deep connection with this particular topic.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. So my family is actually not from Uganda. My parents are both grew up in Kenya, which is next door to Uganda. So still from East Africa. Um, and but as I'm a member of the Ismaili Muslim community in Canada, and so the Canadian Ismaili community regards 1972 and the Uganda expulsion as sort of a founding moment. And the reality is there were handfuls of Ismailis that lived in Canada before. I mean, there's actually records that state, say it actually goes back quite a few decades, but really small pockets, so this was, again, for the community, it's a very landmark kind of moment. And so the and the Ismailis were the largest group that came in this movement, although there are misperceptions, actually a myth that all of the people that came were Ismailis, and that was one of the things that I also wanted to probe in the film, is that there's these certain myths about this movement, not only about that they're successful, but that that they were all Ismailis, and that this whole movement was facilitated by the spiritual leader of the Ismailis, His Highness the Aga Khan, and that's actually not true. That the majority, maybe about 60%, were Ismailis that came to Canada, but there were quite a few people, Goans, who were largely Catholics. And then there's a whole diversity of people that came, Hindus and other Muslim communities, Shia communities, Sunni communities, Sikhs, possibly even, Zoroastrians, and, others. So, but, as Ismailis, we look at this moment as a sort of founding moment. And so it was something, the 50th anniversary was last year, in 2022. And so just wanting to sort of commemorate it, but, it's been talked about a lot in the media. Politicians sometimes get up and talk about it. We have a few notable Ugandan Asian politicians in Canada, or people in the political sphere. And so, one of the things that's usually, the story starts off with Idi Amin. 1971, Idi Amin comes to power. 1972, he throws out all the Asians. And there's very little discussion, I've found, of the backstory of the why. Why did he choose to do that? And what were the conditions in society that created that situation? And and the other factor, again, to go back to it, is that I've never heard anyone talk about it from the Canadian historical angle, that this actually had an impact in Canadian history, refugee and immigration history. And so, I wanted to tell it in a slightly different way. I wanted to take it in a less glorified way, maybe a bit more of a balanced approach to the story. And so those were sort of some of the reasons that I had for taking it on.
Well, and Aleem, when you talk about wanting to, to push back or to interrogate, some of the cleaner histories that are usually told, and this happens in every topic, right? Things get all the rough edges get sanded off, and this cleaner story is presented, not always for bad reasons, just because it's an easier story to tell also, right? So what are the things that both surprised you as you went into the process, and maybe that you found surprised people who have seen the film?
So I think for me, I was surprised by that diversity of the South Asian community. Even for me, when I started to approach the thing, it's been such a long-standing view that it was just Ismailis, and we didn't really, I'd never really given it much thought or looked into it specifically, that there could be I inherently, I kind of, I would, as sort of would have known that there was diversity, but I think because of that sort of popular myth that existed that it was mostly Ismailis, when I started to look into it, then I saw that diversity. I was it was certainly something I learned along the way. The other thing that I think really stuck with me, and as I was working through the film, more and more it kind of I I saw the impact that colonialism had had through the entire course of the story. Um, you know, when you think about South Asians who are moving to Uganda, I mean, a lot of that is facilitated by both of them being British colonies. So the British, British India, they took, for example, a lot of people were brought from British India to Uganda and Kenya and places like that, to East Africa, to build a railway because Uganda is it's not a coastal country. And so what they did was they built from the coast of Kenya, they built a railway across into Uganda. And so that was a way for them to move people, but it was also a way to move resources, and so and colonialism, of course, is a lot of it is about exploitation, and exploitation of economic resources, exploitation of people. And so they were able to then move people from South Asia to Uganda, and so a lot of those people stayed. Now, there were already South Asians living there because there's this historic trading route through the Indian Ocean where people would sail one direction, the winds travel in one direction for several months, and then they reverse direction for a few months. And so there's this long trading route from South Asia, past Persia, the Arabian Peninsula, and then down the East African coast. And so, when you look at, those connections, there's been, Indian traders that have lived in East Africa for centuries, probably. But, there's definitely these connections because of colonialism. And then that other side is that the Canadian connection. The majority of the people that were taken, of the refugees, were taken by the British because the British were essentially responsible for, they were British citizens, they had British passports. A lot of the people that ended up in Canada were people who had given up their British citizenship for Ugandan citizenship and basically had their Ugandan citizenship canceled. And so they became stateless. And so those people, Canada decided to take a lot of the stateless people. And so there, again, there's this colonial connection. Why does Canada do that? It's because the British asked them. And as a former British colony, and as a country that still today has the British monarch as its head of state, it's not that easy for Canada to just say no to a request from the British government. And so so the British asking, can you take, are you willing to take some of these refugees? And Canada decided to do it. Even when you probe into, and one of the things that I look at in the film is that Canadian refugee policies, and they were, even at that time in 1972, during this crisis, were accused by some people of taking the cream of the crop, as it were. That they would go out and they would take the best refugees that they could find. So the people who were highly educated, who were young, who were healthy, if they had an elderly parent who had health issues, they wouldn't take them. So they could be very selective about who they took. And so in a lot of ways, it was very beneficial to Canada to do this, that they could actually pick the people that they thought were the best and would integrate best into society, which maybe interrogate the term, what we mean by integration into society, I think. But but those are all kind of some of the things that those are things that I learned along the way. And certainly that role of colonialism in connecting those three places of British India and British Uganda and formerly British Canada, that certainly was I as I worked through the film, I saw this long connection between the three.
Well, and just listening to, your insights behind making the film and what you learned from it, and from having seen the film, and certainly I recommend to everyone who's watching this conversation to seek out the film, because it is a fascinating way of looking at how policy, the stories we tell, and the story, and part of what you are also interrogating is the story we tell usually about policy tends to be highly rational, and and certainly wherever we can redounds well on our policymakers and our national character. But in truth, and this shouldn't come as a big revelation, one of the things that your film shows is that policies are often reactions to different forces in the immediate moment, as well as decisions that had been taken decades or even longer before, that are still creating a set of circumstances that the policymakers are bumping up against. So it's never quite as clean as we like to think that it could be. And that's certainly, yeah. And but what it makes me think about, just in terms of the mission of our festival, which is to try and think about ways to bring models and ideas and concepts into our own lives, to make our own lives and communities better and more equitable, is actually to keep a certain humility about the decisions that we make, and to not be defensive against this kind of interrogation, because it's actually helpful and clarifying. We may be holding on to something that we think is impartial, but it may carry baggage that we don't intend.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's and I did want to look at the evolution of Canadian refugee policies, because Canada has this reputation as being this very pluralistic country today, a very peaceful, pluralistic society. There's people and organizations out there that will say Canada is the most pluralistic society in the world. And so, I mean, I wanted to kind of interrogate that a little bit and ask questions about, is it, so first of all, it wasn't always that way. I think that's an important thing. And again, it goes back to that colonial history, that actually, Canada didn't want non-European refugees for long. If you were a European refugee, or sorry, not a refugee, if you were a European person who wanted to come and settle in Canada, they were like giving away land to people. And so, but if you were, not from Europe, if you were not white, they didn't want you. And so, or they wanted you as labor and things like that, and then they would send you back. And so, we saw this with, Chinese people being brought to build the railroad. And, again, you see that thing of building railroads and connecting large spaces of territory together. And so, you have, and there's this episode that I mentioned in the film that happened in 1914 or something. I can't remember exactly the date. But the ship, the Komagata Maru, has, with about 300 and some Punjabi immigrants wanting to move to Canada from from British India, and they were basically held off the port of Vancouver for 2 or 3 months and refused to be allowed in, and they were eventually sent back. If those had been British people, they would have been welcomed in and given free land. And so so that policy evolution, and there's a global policy evolution in terms of the UN, the name's slipping my mind right now, but the refugee
Their charter on refugee
charter for refugees. Yeah. And so, where the UN actually defines what a refugee is. And again, the UN beginning, the first instance where they do this is after World War II. And it's, a country has the choice to say, well, we're just going to limit this to Europeans. And even at that point, Canada had a reputation for not taking refugees. Like, even other countries looked at Canada and said, like, why they weren't even taking European refugees. And so but there's this interesting shift that takes place in the 50s and the 60s. And so the policies start to change, partly because of this refugee definition at the UN level. And then partly just, I think, the changes that are happening in Canadian society. And so that leads to, in 1971, the Canadian government creates this multiculturalism policy, which is a remarkable turnaround from where it was a few decades earlier. And so that, we actually recognize that we are not just, Canada's considered to, the Canadian history is all about the French and the British, or the French and the English kind of. And you still have that dichotomy with Quebec as the French province. And the two official languages of Canada are French and English. And so you always had this sort of bilingual, bicultural sort of view that shaped Canada, at least the nation state of Canada. But then this then evolves into a view that actually says, well, we recognize that there's actually multiple cultures living here. And so they created this multiculturalism policy for, there's all kinds of critiques that you can make of Canadian multiculturalism policy, but it was a recognition of a changing society. And so these were all kind of steps that were taken that allowed this movement in 1972 to happen. And then the 1972 happens, and then, as I mentioned earlier, there's a number of things that take place after it. One of the people who's on the ground, who I interviewed in the film, Mike Malloy, he's a Canadian immigration officer, and he then would go on to lead a department, in the immigration service, kind of implementing things that they learned on the ground in Uganda that then affected, various other refugee movements for decades to come. And so, there's definitely this interesting policy evolution. The other thing that I think is kind of interesting is that, and it's kind of, as you mentioned, is that there's an on the ground kind of story. There's policy up here, and then there's people on the ground, and they're making life-changing decisions for people, and sometimes on a really, like, on a whim. And there's stories in the film that I think articulate that, where someone, the person's speaking to someone and says, well, your mother doesn't qualify, but you qualify. But she says, well, I'm too young, I'm whatever, she was like a teenager, and so he took the passport and he changed her date of birth on the passport to make her old enough. And then this family then ends up living in Canada, and interestingly enough, her son, this woman who was too young and has her date of birth changed. Her son is, did his PhD research on this topic of the Canadian history of the Ugandan Asian immigrants or refugees, and wrote a book that was published last year. And so his name's Dr. Shehzan Mohammadi, and he was actually the first person I spoke to when I was looking to make this film, and we'd been in touch a couple of times before, and so I reached out to him, and he, this is this interesting trickle down that this generational kind of story that his grandmother actually gets rejected, and then but in that same interview his mother gets accepted and allowed to bring the rest of the family, and then here he is 50 years later publishing a book about that story. So yeah, so that's
Fascinating.
yeah.
In fact, yeah, so interesting. And immigration is such a incredibly important issue for all countries and all peoples. So from what you have learned from what you've explored with your film, what can people do to support your work, this film, and how can they help spread the word about it? And also, are you doing follow-up on it? You've mentioned a couple of things that sound like you could be following up with either another film or some more work on this. Is there something? What's in your future?
So I mean, in terms of what was the first question? Sorry, just to go back.
What can people do to support this film?
So I mean, right now I'm just taking it to festivals, like the Global Peace Festival and others. And so, and I'm I think coming to watch it. I don't have a specific call to action or anything like that, but I mean, certainly, I think it's an interesting story, and I think it would be great if people could come and watch it. I think, I'm looking for distribution. I'm looking at, my options for distributing it after doing festivals. So, in terms of what's next, I have thought about, there's so many other stories that I think you could tell. I mean, if I had more time and more budget, I was saying to some people that you could turn this into a series kind of thing, rather than, it could have been a series. Probably almost enough in material to make a generic piece about, Canadian immigration history or refugee history. And so, I mean, there's definitely a lot to follow up on. For me, I mean, I'm not sure. Like, a lot of my, as a filmmaker, a lot of my one of my goals has always been to, as a Muslim, has been to look at some of the misperceptions about Muslims and Islam, and to try and challenge some of those. So, some of the other films that I've done are kind of more in that sort of space. But I think the general, I think that I think I work in the intersections of, history and diversity and pluralism and religion and culture and society and all these kind of things. So, most of my films have been and probably will continue to be in that general space.
And can we find out more about your other work on your website?
Yeah, so you can, crescentproductions.com. And so some of the other films that I've done are available there, and there's information about some of the work that I've done in terms of misperceptions of Islam or Muslim history and that kind of thing. I think I would say, sorry, as maybe a broader reflection, this, if there's one takeaway that I would say, I would like people to walk away with is, as a general thought, is that we tend to, as you mentioned earlier, is that we tend to try and simplify things. When we tell stories, we always try to simplify. And with this film, and with a lot of my films, I tried to take a balanced approach and not just glorify it or take one perspective on it, but to recognize the complexity of the story, and the many, many different layers and the many different sort of aspects to it. And so I would say generally my approach to filmmaking is to embrace complexity, the complexity of society and human life. And so I guess my ask to most people would be that, which would actually probably make for a more peaceful world, I would hope, is that if people were to embrace the complexity of the world, rather than being polarized into one view or another, I think that actually would, make for a better world. So.
Well, thank you, Aleem. I think that's a beautiful thought to end on, because we shouldn't be afraid of the nuance and complexity of life. That's what makes it interesting. So thank you so much for this insightful conversation about your film, Thrown into Canada, the settlement of Asian refugees from Uganda. Again, you can find out more information about Thrown into Canada and all of Aleem's work by visiting crescentproductions.com, and specifically crescentproductions.com/thrown-into-Canada, to look specifically into maybe bringing Thrown into Canada to your community, and to find out how to see the film as a part of the upcoming Global Peace Film Festival. Please be sure to visit peacefilmfest.org, our website, where you can find out all the information about, first, our in-person programming, which begins September 19th and ends September 23rd, as well as our virtual screening programs that begin September 25th and run through October the 1st. Again, please go to peacefilmfest.org for all of those details. Thank you for listening and watching, and we will see you at the next Glow.